I'm going to pick out some questions. This one from Gordon in Sheffield. To what extent are Quakers, quotes, the entitled and powerful, unquote, already and getting relatively rich as a result? We might not be running businesses anymore, but we are still nonetheless a sellout. From the other side of the now collapsed red wall, do Quakers just look like another bunch of champagne socialists?
Well, I mean, that is a valid accusation that can be made about us, and we need to take seriously who we are, our place within society, the extent to which we really understand the injustices of society, and the extent to which we take for granted the things that are our privilege. And you know, I'm as guilty as anyone else of you know, standing here and spouting high principle whilst at the same time living a comfortable life in a pleasant neighborhood with a secure job, as secure as it can be in these circumstances. And I think one of the things that we learn from liberation theology and from other radical forms of spirituality is that you don't understand oppression unless you are either oppressed yourself or you're prepared to get very close to those who are and to know what their lives are like. And one of our problems is, and I'm as guilty as this as anyone, we don't know poor people and people who are oppressed in a close enough way. We can live in bubbles that are quite comfortable and separate. And I think part of the discomfort of all of this is facing up to the need to recognize our comfort and be willing to step outside of that for the sake of justice. But it's not easy, is it? I quite like to have quite a comfortable, pleasant existence. And I don't particularly want to put myself in a difficult situation. But if we're thinking about the Salters, let's just think this is the Salter seminar. The Salters are a very good example of people who were prepared to lay down their privilege and live amongst people who were struggling economically and socially, and to live side by side with them and to share their experiences. And we're all called to different things, and maybe we're not all called to that. But I feel that very closely in terms of my own comfortableness and my own complacency.
I'm sure we can all relate to that. And another question from David Bale. Is the history of Quakerism, in a sense, a parable or metaphor for the debasement of true socialism into a kind of social democratic religion in which people who mean well are tamed from being effective and a challenge to being acceptable, nice, and quite friendly, really, but only because they are no longer a real threat or real challenge to the social order and the entrenched socio-economic system that protects and enriches the entitled and powerful?
It's hard to avoid the fact that there's truth in that. I mean, on the one hand, all across history, there have been radical groups that have emerged at various points, got themselves into conflict with the social order, found the need to survive, and then become very, very successful and quite rich and comfortable. You know, and it's not just Quakers. There's time and time again that has happened. And I mean, I suppose if I'm speaking as a Quaker, the key question is, to what extent am I really surrendering myself to the leadings of the Spirit? To what extent am I really prepared to lay down my own interests, my own will, and listen to that bigger, deeper, world-changing kind of spirit that, as we've heard, is within all of us? What's stopping me doing that? And comfort and respectability is inevitably part of that. You know, if we look at the history of the labour movement, what we see is people starting off at the grassroots, becoming politicians, and ending up in the House of Lords. And you know, and you know, and I'm not knocking people in the House of Lords for the sake of it, but it's interesting the way in which the we talked about Quaker pragmatism, but it's interesting how the social structure is very pragmatic in how it gets people and draws them in and neutralizes them and makes them safe, you know. And I suppose one of the big challenges for us is, how can we be dangerous people and also peaceable people? I'm reminded of Tom Shakespeare's, one of his most memorable phrases during the Swarthmore lecture this year was, what would it be that Quakers could do to make us really unpopular? And are we prepared to do that? You know, do we want to be seen to be kind of rebellious in a nice kind of a way, but actually not really threaten anything? And so actually we quite like being nice and respectable. And those are some of the tensions that I know I'm caught up in. And I'm sure others find themselves in that as well. So the way in which power neutralizes is, it either crushes or it neutralizes. If it can't control you, it will kill you and crush you. If it can control you, it will neutralize you and make you less of a threat. And I think those are really big issues, and I've got no obvious solution to them necessarily.
And a question from Yasmin Pinks. Do we need to keep trying to perfect ourselves inwardly, listening to the spirit, so that we can be more effective, progressing justice, peace, equality outwardly, while we wait for the leadership that can bring all these works together in the body of Christ?
I mean, that's really tapping into that dilemma between the personal and the structural transformation. And I think we have to accept that both are essential. On the one hand, it's often structural changes that change human conceptions. So, you know, from a Marxist point of view, physical changes in the economy and the way systems are organized change people. But on the other hand, we want to accept deep in our spirituality is the assumption that the solution to the way the world is already there. It's within us. It's possible for us to tap into it. It's available to everyone. Are we prepared to surrender enough to it to allow it to do its work, that we become the prophets that we need to be? And so holding that tension between doing stuff, but also being sufficiently contemplative and surrendered is one of the great tensions within the Quaker way. And we need to get it right, because for early friends, what's strongest about them is the way they bind the inward and the spiritual to the outward and the physical. One of the dangers in the second generation is the separating of those and the prioritization of the inward and the spiritual over and against the political and the outward. So I think we need to draw heavily on our tradition, but also accept that sometimes we need to get out there and get our hands dirty as well.
Thank you, Stuart. And comment from question from Manju Ray of Sheffield Central. Many people think Quakers now give more attention to business organisation rather than personal and spiritual development. What are your comments?
Well, I mean, obviously there are ways in which having to spend a lot of energies on managing structures and buildings and so on inevitably draws you away from the necessity of surrendering yourself to that power that's beyond ourselves, that can transform all things. Having said that, that's one of the dangers of trying to function within a world that expects you to have structures, expects you to have buildings and all the rest of it. And I think, you know, I can absolutely see the benefits potentially of liberating ourselves from those things. But life is complicated, isn't it? Sometimes we can use our assets and our resources to do really good things. So, I mean, one of the questions is, yes, by all means, simplify structures, but maybe one of the holy experiments that we can do, and I know Quakers are already doing this, is using their assets to change the world, to make it better, even in a very limited way. And so I guess, again, I'm being a little bit sort of cautious in falling down on one side or another, but I can certainly see the danger of spending so much time managing your structures and your assets and so on, that you miss the very thing that is really the root of everything, that sense of collectively surrendering to the power of the spirit that turns the world upside down And if we can't find time to do that, if our lives are so busy that we can't find the time to do it individually and collectively, then based on our understanding of our tradition, we've got a problem.
One last question, Stuart. I'm not sure it is actually a question. It's from Nozizwe and Jeremy in Cape Town, who ask simply, why are we not all socialists?
We live within a world in which, I mean, this is actually going back to that kind of traditional Christian language. We enter into a world that is structured in a way that makes it much easier to do bad than it is to do good. And so there's a great danger in seeing sin as primarily a personal flaw. It's not, it's about structural organization of the world. And the fact that we, what is it? This is a classic kind of thing, isn't it? What is it that would make perfectly normal people who in normal circumstances would have lived an ordinary life become the kind of people who would herd Jews into concentration camps and gas chambers? This is not about personal flaws or not. It's about the way in which the world is structured in a way that makes it more likely that we're going to attach ourselves to evil and injustice than take the step out and attach ourselves to justice and to equality. And I think that's, we're all products of our environment. I'm a socialist in part because of the influence of my grandfather, who, was a great trade unionist and socialist, and that influenced me. But I may well have grown up in a different situation where I was influenced by other things. And maybe that prompts us to say, although we don't want to be evangelical and proselytizing, that could be a danger if we're not prepared to be more open about who we are, about what we believe in, about what we value, about what we've discerned to be the truth. If we're not prepared to be open about that, how can we ever expect anybody else to take us seriously or to accept the validity of what we found to be true?